"Ear than standard," she noted, and the frame had been fitted with wool batting, a construction that rendered conversation within the study virtually inaudible to anyone in the corridor or adjacent rooms. This detail, which Craddock had recorded in his notebook with the bored efficiency of a man transcribing the weather forecast, caused Whimsy to regard Mrs. Wickham with renewed interest. He asked her, quite casually, whether she had heard any sounds emanating from the study during the relevant period. Any cry, any crash, any disturbance whatsoever. Mrs. Wickham's response was immediate and firm: absolutely nothing. The study had been, for all intents and purposes, sealed off from the domestic world, a small island of silence existing within the greater cacophony of household life. Christopher Ashworth, when pressed on this same matter during his second interview, had grown unaccountably anxious, his fingers beginning to fidget with the cigarette case he had extracted from his waistcoat pocket with the ritualistic care of a man requiring a prop to maintain his composure. He had not, he insisted, heard anything from the study. One could not hear anything from the study. Surely Mrs. Wickham had made that perfectly clear. Yet something in the quality of his denial suggested not the simple truthfulness of an innocent man, but rather the careful rehearsal of a story that had been constructed with meticulous precision. Whimsy found himself wondering whether Christopher had spent the afternoon in the library as claimed, or whether he had spent it elsewhere, constructing precisely this narrative of inaudible isolation. The agricultural reports, when Whimsy examined them later that evening, turned out to be of surprisingly recent origin, dated within the past fortnight, with notations in Christopher's handwriting scattered throughout the margins. Yet the library assistant, a thin, nervous young woman named Miss Pemberton, whose primary function appeared to be the organization of the Ashworth collection, mentioned quite casually that Mr. Christopher had not actually consulted those particular volumes for more than 2 months. This discrepancy, which Whimsy had introduced into the conversation with the apparent artlessness of a man making idle conversation over tea, caused the young woman to blush considerably and attempt to backtrack. But the damage, as it were, had already been done. The clock in the entrance hall continued to stand at 3 o'clock, its hands frozen in eternal accusation, and Whimsy found himself returning to it repeatedly throughout his first evening at Thornfield, examining it from different angles, as though it might suddenly yield up its secrets through sheer force of repeated observation. The mechanism was genuinely sophisticated, suggesting someone with more than casual knowledge of horological engineering. Yet when Whimsy inquired whether anyone in the household possessed such expertise, he received only blank stares from the assembled staff and a somewhat irritated comment from Craddock suggesting that such specialized knowledge was hardly likely to be common among domestic servants or minor country gentlemen. This was precisely where, Whimsy reflected, the inspector's thinking went consistently astray. The assumption that certain knowledge could only be possessed by certain classes of person had blinded more investigators than vanity ever could. A servant could become obsessed with mechanical principles. A gentleman might learn them through mere enthusiastic amateur tinkering. The real question was not who possessed the knowledge, but rather who had both the knowledge and the motivation to apply it in the precise manner evidenced by the frozen clock. By the following morning, a telegram had arrived from London containing the preliminary findings of the police laboratory regarding the paperweight. It bore no fingerprints whatsoever, suggesting that whoever had wielded it had taken considerable care to avoid leaving any trace. Moreover, the laboratory had confirmed that the weight and consistency of the implement matched perfectly with the nature of the wound inflicted upon Mrs. Ashworth's skull, which meant that the criminal had known precisely what instrument to select for his purpose. This suggested premeditation rather than the crime of passion that the police had begun to tentatively advance as their working theory. Whimsy had received this information with an expression of polite interest and had immediately requested access to the study once more, this time with the express intention of examining not the crime scene itself, but rather the arrangement of objects upon Mrs. Ashworth's desk. A woman, Whimsy had observed over the course of his years, maintained her desk in a manner that revealed considerably more about her character than any confession might. Mrs. Ashworth's desk had been remarkably orderly, bills filed meticulously, correspondence organized by date, a leather journal containing what appeared to be household accounts rendered in a precise, almost obsessively neat handwriting. Yet it was a single item that caused Whimsy to pause, a letter, only recently begun, addressed to someone named Margaret. The letter started with considerable warmth, but had been abandoned after the opening pleasantries, the remainder of the page blank as though the writer had been interrupted mid-composition or had simply changed her mind about continuing. Whimsy had carefully noted the date, Tuesday last, and had mentioned it to no one, though he had felt Craddock's eyes upon him, watching him for signs of revelation that the inspector was not yet prepared. To witness, the letter to Margaret proved to be Whimsy's point of entry into what would eventually become the central mystery of the case, though he revealed nothing of this to Craddock, who remained fixed in his conviction that Christopher Ashworth's nervous demeanor and convenient inheritance constituted sufficient grounds for arrest. Whimsy, however, had learned long ago that the most obvious solution was rarely the correct one, particularly in cases involving women of considerable means and established social position. A woman with Mrs. Ashworth's wealth and status did not simply accumulate enemies. She accumulated secrets, and those secrets, Whimsy had found, were far more likely to result in murder than any amount of financial desperation. He had therefore made discreet inquiries regarding Mrs. Ashworth's correspondence, discovering that she maintained regular contact with a Margaret Thornton, a woman of approximately her own age who resided in Hampshire, and who, according to the household records that Mrs. Wickham had rather reluctantly provided, had visited Thornfield on at least 4 occasions within the past 12 months. This in itself was innocuous enough. Elderly women of the professional classes were entitled to their friendships, yet it was what Whimsy discovered through entirely separate channels that proved illuminating. A telephone call to a contact at the British Museum had revealed that Margaret Thornton was not merely a casual acquaintance, but rather a woman who had published several scholarly articles on the subject of medieval manuscripts under the pseudonym M.T. Thornton, work that suggested considerable intellectual accomplishment and a circle of academic connections that extended well beyond the conventional boundaries of polite society. Mrs. Ashworth, it appeared, had been something rather more than the idle widow the local constabulary had assumed her to be. A second telephone call, this time to a former colleague from Whimsy's Oxford days, who now maintained chambers in Lincoln's Inn, had produced even more intriguing information. Mrs. Ashworth had recently altered her will, a modification made within the past 6 months and conducted with considerable secrecy through a solicitor in London who was not the family's traditional legal representative. The nature of these alterations remained confidential, naturally, but the timing of the change suggested that Mrs. Ashworth had been contemplating some significant rearrangement of her affairs mere months before her death. This discovery had prompted Whimsy to conduct a more thorough examination of the household itself, and it was during this renewed investigation that he encountered the second genuine anomaly of the case. The kitchen staff, a cook of perhaps 55 years, and a scullery maid of indeterminate age named Fiona, had been questioned regarding their whereabouts during the critical period, and both had provided accounts that were perfectly consistent with Mrs. Wickham's testimony. They had been occupied with the preparation of the afternoon tea, a task that could easily consume 30 minutes or more when conducted with proper attention to detail. Yet when Whimsy had inquired, with apparent randomness, about the boiler room and the precise mechanism by which hot water was maintained for the household, Cook had grown unaccountably evasive. The boiler, she explained with evident discomfort, had required attention on that very afternoon. Something about the pressure gauge behaving erratically, suggesting that the system required inspection. Fiona had been sent to fetch the plumber from the village, a journey that would have required her to leave the kitchen for a period of perhaps 15 to 20 minutes. This detail, which Cook seemed reluctant to volunteer, and which had clearly been omitted from her initial statement to the police, suggested that the afternoon's chronology was considerably more complicated than anyone had previously admitted. Whimsy's inquiries regarding the plumber had led him to a Mr. Dinsdale, a taciturn individual of perhaps 40 who maintained his business in the village and who, when pressed, had admitted that he had indeed visited Thornfield on Thursday afternoon, though he had found nothing whatsoever wrong with the boiler upon examination. It had been performing perfectly adequately, He had noted with the mild irritation of a tradesman summoned for no legitimate purpose, and he had informed Fiona as much before departing. This meant, by simple logical necessity, that either Cook or Fiona or both had contrived to create a distraction during the precise period when Mrs. Ashworth was being murdered, a distraction so mundane and believable that it would have attracted little notice had anyone been sufficiently suspicious to inquire about it. The implications of this discovery had caused Whimsy to regard both women with renewed interest, though he maintained an expression of perfect blandness when subsequently interviewing them. Fiona, the younger of the two, proved to be considerably more nervous than Cook, her hands trembling slightly as she explained the events of that afternoon with excessive detail that suggested either genuine anxiety or the careful rehearsal of a prepared statement. Cook, by contrast, had adopted an air of wounded indignation at being questioned as though she were some common criminal, yet her protests seemed rather less genuine than the defensive posturing of an innocent person might have been. There was about her a quality of calculated resignation, as though she had anticipated precisely this line of questioning and had already resigned herself to the consequence of her evasion. When Whimsy had mentioned, quite casually, that he had spoken with Mr. Dinsdale and that the man had found nothing whatsoever amiss with the boiler, Fiona had gone noticeably pale, and Cook's jaw had tightened in a manner that suggested she had made some crucial miscalculation. Yet neither woman had offered any explanation or justification for their behavior, and it was this refusal to provide any acceptable alibi that convinced Whimsy that he was beginning to perceive the outline of something far more intricate than a simple crime of passion or inheritance-motivated murder. It was during an evening conversation with Christopher Ashworth, conducted ostensibly to clarify certain minor points regarding his movements on the afternoon in question, that Whimsy had begun to perceive the true nature of the conspiracy that appeared to be forming beneath the surface of Thornfield Manor's respectable exterior. Christopher, fortified by a brandy and apparently believing that his initial interrogation had concluded satisfactorily, had grown considerably more candid in his remarks, displaying that particular quality of inherited arrogance that suggested he believed himself fundamentally insulated from serious consequences. When Whimsy had mentioned, with perfect indifference, that the household staff appeared to have been somewhat confused regarding their precise occupations during the critical period, Christopher had visibly stiffened, his casual demeanor evaporating like morning mist. The young man had then committed the cardinal error of attempting to explain away the discrepancy before being formally accused of anything, a move that in Whimsy's experience almost invariably indicated guilty knowledge of some variety. Christopher had insisted that Cook had been entirely correct. There had been trouble with the boiler, a perfectly ordinary domestic occurrence requiring no elaborate explanation. Yet when pressed as to why such a minor mechanical issue would necessitate the fabrication of an elaborate deception regarding the plumber's visit, Christopher had stumbled, his carefully prepared narrative suddenly becoming incoherent. It was at this precise moment that Whimsy had recognized the fundamental flaw in everyone's assumptions regarding the crime. The consensus had been that Mrs. Ashworth had been murdered at approximately 3 o'clock, based upon Dr. Marchmont's admittedly imprecise assessment of the body's condition when it had been discovered at 3:15 by Mrs. Wickham. Yet if the boiler had truly required attention, if there had genuinely been some domestic crisis requiring Cook's attention and Fiona's departure from the kitchen, then the timing of events became considerably more malleable. Whimsy had therefore requested permission to conduct an experiment, a proposal that had caused Craddock to regard him with the suspicious wariness of a man who had learned through painful experience that the amateur's experiments frequently resulted in complications rather than clarifications. Nevertheless, the inspector had acquiesced, perhaps recognizing that his case against Christopher was beginning to develop hairline fractures that required either reinforcement or wholesale reconstruction. The experiment had been conducted on the following morning, with all parties assembled in their respective locations, Cook and Fiona in the kitchen, Christopher in the library, Mrs. Wickham in her quarters, and the remaining household staff distributed throughout the manor in positions they had occupied on the afternoon of the murder. Whimsy had positioned himself in the study with the body of Mrs. Ashworth, represented by a carefully weighted dummy positioned precisely as the corpse had been discovered. At a predetermined signal, Cook had begun to prepare the afternoon tea with deliberate care, a task that required approximately 12 minutes to complete. At the 8-minute mark, Fiona had departed the kitchen to summon the plumber, a journey that consumed an additional 7 minutes. This meant that for a period of approximately 5 minutes, from 8 to 13 minutes after the commencement of the preparation, neither Cook nor Fiona could have accounted for the other's precise location. During this interval, Christopher was theoretically confined to the library, Mrs. Wickham was attending to other household duties, and the remaining staff were scattered throughout the manor. The critical question, which Wimsey had posed to himself with considerable intellectual satisfaction, was not whether someone had murdered Mrs. Ashworth, but rather whether the murderer had possessed the knowledge that a convenient window of opportunity would present itself precisely when it did. This suggested premeditation of an extraordinarily sophisticated variety, not merely the planning of a murder, but the orchestration of the precise circumstances that would render that murder possible. Wimsey had then turned his attention to the grandfather clock with renewed purpose, examining its mechanism with the concentrated focus of a man seeking to confirm a crucial hypothesis. What he had discovered was that the clock's alteration had not been conducted hastily or without considerable technical knowledge. The weights had been adjusted with mathematical precision, the pendulum displaced by a measurement that could only have been achieved through the application of careful calibration. Moreover, the modification appeared to have been made some time prior to the morning of the murder, suggesting that whoever had tampered with the clock had possessed both advanced knowledge of its requirement and sufficient confidence in their pilier. To risk detection during the preceding hours. This detail, when combined with the revelation that someone in the household had deliberately created a false distraction involving the plumber, began to suggest a conspiracy of remarkable complexity. Wimsey had therefore requested that Craddock conduct inquiries regarding the financial circumstances of both Cook and Fiona, a request that had initially provoked skepticism until preliminary investigations had revealed that both women possessed relatives who were currently experiencing considerable financial difficulties. Cook's brother had been recently convicted of embezzlement and was facing substantial legal costs. Fiona's sister had entered into a disastrous marriage with a man who had subsequently abandoned her, leaving her with 3 children and no visible means of support. These discoveries had transformed the investigation from a seemingly straightforward case of inheritance murder into something far more intricate, a conspiracy that had apparently involved the household staff in some capacity, a conspiracy that required Mrs. Ashworth's death, and that had been orchestrated with sufficient care to suggest months of advance planning. Yet the fundamental question remained: who had conceived this elaborate scheme, and more importantly, what possible motivation could justify the murder of a woman who appeared to have been considerably more complex and sympathetic in her personal relationships than her public reputation suggested? The letter to Margaret had proven sufficiently intriguing that Wimsey had decided to conduct a personal visit to Hampshire, an excursion that he had undertaken on the pretext of requiring certain clarifications regarding Mrs. Ashworth's scholarly interests, but which he suspected would yield considerably more substantial revelations. Margaret Thornton resided in a modest but tastefully appointed cottage situated on the outskirts of a small village, the sort of dwelling that suggested intellectual accomplishment without ostentation, and she had received Wimsey with the cautious politeness of a woman accustomed to deflecting unwanted inquiries from the official authorities. Yet when Wimsey had identified himself not as a representative of the constabulary, but rather as a private investigator retained by certain interested parties, Margaret's demeanor had shifted perceptibly, her rigid posture relaxing into something approaching cautious cooperation. She had known Helena Ashworth for more than 30 years, she had explained, dating back to their time as young women at an Oxford college, an era when such opportunities for female education were considerably more rare than they had subsequently become. Helena had possessed a formidable intellect, Margaret had observed, and had harbored ambitions towards scholarly work that had been systematically suppressed by her marriage to Sir Humphrey. a man of considerable wealth but limited imagination, who had regarded his wife's intellectual pursuits with a mixture of tolerant amusement and subtle discouragement. The marriage, Margaret had continued with evident reluctance, had been fundamentally unhappy, though Helena had endured it with the stoic resignation that women of her generation had learned to regard as a virtue rather than a tragedy. Upon Sir Humphrey's death 5 years prior, Helena had begun to reclaim certain aspects of her intellectual life, corresponding with Margaret and other scholars in her field. Yet she had done so with a quality of desperate urgency that Margaret had found increasingly troubling. Helena had recently begun to speak of making significant alterations to her will, Margaret had revealed, changes that would ensure her considerable fortune would be directed toward purposes that her nephew Christopher would find considerably less gratifying than simple inheritance. These alterations, according to Helena's descriptions, would establish a scholarship fund for women pursuing advanced study in medieval history and manuscript preservation, work that Helena regarded as infinitely more valuable than the perpetuation of her nephew's indolent lifestyle. This revelation had illuminated a considerable portion of the case's obscuring fog, yet it had simultaneously introduced a new and troubling complication. If Christopher had possessed advance knowledge of his aunt's intention to substantially reduce his inheritance, knowledge that appeared entirely possible, given that the household staff would inevitably become aware of such intentions through the simple osmosis of domestic gossip, then his motive for murder became not merely financial, but desperately urgent. A man who expected to inherit a considerable fortune might commit murder under extraordinary circumstances. A man who expected to watch that fortune slip through his fingers due to his aunt's intellectual pretensions and philanthropic impulses possessed a far more acute motivation for violent action. Moreover, if Christopher had orchestrated the entire conspiracy, recruiting Cook and Fiona through the exploitation of their financial vulnerabilities, then he had demonstrated a remarkable capacity for manipulation and deception. Yet something about this conclusion continued to trouble Whimsy, a certain quality of incomplete logic that suggested the puzzle remained only partially solved. He had therefore pressed Margaret for additional information regarding Helena's mental and emotional state during the months preceding her death, inquiries that had prompted a sudden and visible emotional response from the scholar. Helena, Margaret had admitted with considerable reluctance, displaying increasingly erratic behavior in her final months, sudden mood swings ranging from exultant optimism to profound despair, scattered references to setting matters right and correcting past injustices, and most disturbingly, repeated allusions to certain secrets that Helena had harbored for decades, and which she had apparently decided must be revealed before her death. Margaret had attempted to press Helena for specifics, but her friend had remained frustratingly evasive, insisting only that Christopher must never be allowed to inherit her estate, and that the household staff must be provided for generously in recognition of their years of faithful service. These cryptic pronouncements had been accompanied by a peculiar intensity that Margaret had found simultaneously compelling and deeply unsettling, as though Helena were driven by some internal compulsion that transcended ordinary rational motivation. When pressed further, Margaret had reluctantly divulged that Helena had made reference to the truth about what happened at Thornfield all those years ago, a remark that had prompted Whimsy to inquire with considerably more directness whether Margaret possessed any knowledge of what Helena might have meant by such a deliberately obscure allusion. Margaret had responded with an extended silence, during which Whimsy had observed the woman's internal struggle with considerable interest, recognizing in her hesitation the conflict between loyalty to her deceased friend's privacy and the desire to assist in the investigation of her murder. Finally, with evident reluctance, Margaret had explained that Helena had once mentioned, in the context of a far more personal conversation than she typically permitted herself, that the death of Sir Humphrey 5 years prior had not been quite the straightforward conclusion of natural causes that had been recorded in the official accounts. Helena had never provided specific details, but the implication had been sufficiently clear that Margaret had understood her friend to be suggesting the possibility of deliberate involvement in her husband's demise. involvement that Helena had apparently viewed with a quality of complex emotion that transcended simple remorse or guilt. This revelation had transformed the entire investigation into something altogether more Byzantine and disturbing than Whimsy had initially suspected. If Helena Ashworth had been involved in her husband's death 5 years prior, if she had harbored for all those intervening years the knowledge of this involvement and the psychological burden that such knowledge inevitably entailed, then her recent decision to alter her will and her cryptic allusions to setting matters right acquired a deeply troubling significance. She had apparently decided that the time had come for confession, for the revelation of long-concealed secrets, for the attempt to construct some form of moral redemption through the disposition of her estate in accordance with her genuine values rather than her nephew's inheritance expectations. This meant, by necessary inference, that someone close to her, someone who had knowledge of her intentions and who possessed a compelling motive to prevent the revelation of those intentions, had decided that murder was the appropriate response to her threat. Whimsy's return to Thornfield had been conducted with considerably more urgency than his initial arrival, though he had maintained an outward demeanor of perfect composure as he had stepped from the motor car into the grey afternoon drizzle that had begun to fall across the countryside. His first action had been to request an immediate interview with Mrs. Wickham, the housekeeper whose position at Thornfield had spanned approximately 13 years, a tenure that would have encompassed the period of S.I.R. Humphrey's death and the subsequent 5 years of Helena's widowhood. The housekeeper had received him in her small private sitting room, a space that revealed considerably more about her character than the formal drawing rooms of the manor, modest but meticulously organized, with shelves of carefully arranged books and a small writing desk upon which correspondence appeared to be conducted with considerable regularity. When Whimsy had inquired, with apparent casualness, regarding the circumstances of Sir Humphrey's death, Mrs. Wickham had responded with the sort of careful recitation that suggested she had rehearsed her account repeatedly over the intervening years. Sir Humphrey had suffered a sudden heart seizure, she had explained, one evening after dinner, an event that had been entirely consistent with his medical condition. He had been a man of considerable corpulence and sedentary habits, factors that the physician had identified as contributing to his cardiac vulnerability. The death had been declared natural causes, no inquest had been deemed necessary, and the matter had been concluded with the efficiency that surrounded the departure of wealthy individuals from the world of the living. Yet when Whimsy had pressed for more specific details, the precise time of the seizure, the exact nature of Sir Humphrey's activities preceding the event, the particular symptoms that had been observed, Mrs. Wickham's account had become increasingly vague and contradictory, suggesting either genuine uncertainty regarding events now 5 years past, or deliberate evasion of information she possessed. It was this evasion that had prompted Whimsy to request access to the household records maintained by Mrs. Wickham regarding the staff's activities on the evening of Sir Humphrey's death. These records, which the housekeeper had produced with obvious reluctance, had revealed a curie. Hour's entry dated for that particular evening. Cook's evening preparation disrupted by mechanical failure in kitchen range, requiring repair work extending until 9 o'clock in the evening. This notation had struck Whimsy with the force of sudden illumination, for it suggested a pattern of remarkable consistency spanning 5 years, the deliberate creation of domestic disruptions that would provide convenient opportunities for activities that required privacy and freedom from observation. The implications of this discovery had been sufficiently significant that Whimsy had immediately requested that Craddock conduct a thorough examination of Sir Humphrey's death certificate and the attending physician's findings. Inquiries that had revealed a document signed by Dr. Marchmont himself, the same physician who had conducted the preliminary investigation into Mrs. Ashworth's murder. This convergence of circumstances had seemed almost too convenient to be coincidental. Yet Whimsy had learned, through years of investigative experience, that truly remarkable coincidences did occasionally occur in the real world. Though they typically masked rather deeper patterns of causation, Dr. Marchmont, when subsequently interviewed regarding his findings in connection with Sir Humphrey's death, had initially attempted to maintain a professional demeanor while discussing events now considerably removed from the present investigation. Yet when Whimsy had mentioned, with perfect indifference, that he had been reviewing certain historical medical records and had observed that Sir Humphrey's symptoms, as described, did not entirely accord with those typically associated with cardiac seizure. The physician had noticeably paled. The doctor had admitted, with evident reluctance and considerable defensive protestation, that he had accepted a substantial payment from Mrs. Ashworth, approximately £1 prior to Sir Humphrey's death, a payment ostensibly rendered in gratitude for medical services provided to the household staff, but which the doctor had subsequently come to regard with considerable unease. He had insisted with obvious desperation, participated in any criminal activity, but he had agreed to attribute Sir Humphrey's death to natural causes without conducting any detailed forensic examination. An agreement that had required him to suppress certain observations regarding the body's condition that might have suggested alternative conclusions. When pressed regarding what those observations had entailed, Dr. Marchmont had reluctantly described findings consistent with poisoning, the particular discoloration of the lips and extremities, the peculiar odor that had emanated from the body, the pattern of bodily fluid accumulation that did not accord with simple cardiac failure. This confession had transformed the murder of Mrs. Ashworth from an isolated crime into one element of a far more extensive and disturbing conspiracy spanning 5 years. If Helena Ashworth had indeed orchestrated or participated in her husband's death, if she had paid the physician to conceal evidence of poisoning, then she had harbored for all those intervening years the knowledge of this fundamental crime, a knowledge that appeared to have generated an increasingly urgent psychological compulsion toward confession and redemption. Yet someone in the household had apparently become aware of Helena's intention to reveal this historical crime, and that someone had decided that murder was the appropriate preventive measure. The question that now confronted Whimsy was not whether Mrs. Ashworth had been murdered, but rather who among the household had possessed both the knowledge of her intentions and the motivation to prevent their revelation. The evidence appeared to point toward Christopher Ashworth as the orchestrator, yet Whimsy remained troubled by certain inconsistencies in the timeline, and by the curious passivity that Christopher had displayed during the investigation. A passivity that suggested a man reacting to events rather than directing them. This distinction, Whimsy had observed through long experience, was frequently the crucial difference between the primary architect of a crime and merely a secondary participant in its commission. It was during a carefully orchestrated conversation with Fiona, the scullery maid, that Whimsy had begun to perceive the true configuration of the conspiracy, a revelation that had emerged not through direct interrogation, but rather through the simple expedient of allowing the young woman to believe that he had already solved the case and was merely seeking confirmation of details he had already established. Fiona, placed in the position of having nothing further to lose by maintaining her silence, had gradually begun to disclose information that painted an altogether different picture of the household dynamics than anyone had previously suggested. She had admitted, with evident relief at finally being able to unburden herself, that it had been Mrs. Wickham who had first approached her regarding the creation of the false distraction involving the plumber. Mrs. Wickham had explained, with considerable persuasiveness, that Mrs. Ashworth was planning to dismiss both Cook and Fiona without references or compensation, a revelation that had terrified Fiona given her vulnerable economic position and her responsibilities toward her sister's dependent children. Mrs. Wickham had offered Fiona a substantial sum of money provided Fiona had later understood by Christopher Ashworth in exchange for her participation in creating a brief window of time during which certain unspecified activity could occur without observation. Fiona had not known precisely what that activity entailed, though she had subsequently come to suspect that it involved Mrs. Ashworth's murder. Cook, Fiona had revealed, had been similarly recruited through the exploitation of her brother's legal difficulties, though Cook had appeared to possess considerably greater understanding of what her participation would ultimately entail. This revelation had shifted the investigation's focus decisively toward Mrs. Wickham, yet it had simultaneously introduced a troubling question regarding the housekeeper's motivation. Mrs. Wickham had occupied her position at Thornfield for 13 years, a tenure that had encompassed the period of Sir Humphrey's death, and she had apparently maintained a position of considerable trust within the household. Why would such a woman, apparently secure in her employment and possessed of a comfortable position, involve herself in the orchestration of murder? The answer had emerged through a careful examination of the household accounts maintained by Mrs. Wickham herself, records that revealed a pattern of increasingly substantial sums being diverted into accounts that bore no apparent connection to legitimate household expenses. These diversions had begun approximately 5 years prior, immediately following Sir Humphrey's death, and had accelerated significantly in the months preceding Helena's murder. When cross-referenced with the payments made by Christopher Ashworth from his personal accounts, the financial trail had become unmistakably clear. Mrs. Wickham had apparently been receiving substantial payments from Christopher for years, payments that suggested she possessed knowledge regarding his aunt's involvement in his uncle's death and had been systematically blackmailing him in exchange for her silence. This discovery had illuminated the entire structure of the conspiracy with the sudden clarity of a lamp being ignited in darkness. Mrs. Wickham had known, through her position in the household, that Helena had discovered evidence of Christopher's knowledge regarding the circumstances of Sir Humphrey's death, evidence that Helena had apparently obtained through her own investigation into the historical events and that she had subsequently decided to reveal. Mrs. Wickham had apparently informed Christopher of his aunt's intention to confess, and Christopher had responded by enlisting Mrs. Wickham's assistance in preventing that confession through the only means that seemed available to him, the murder of his aunt. Mrs. Wickham had then orchestrated the creation of the false distraction with the boiler, had recruited Fiona and Cook through the exploitation of their economic vulnerabilities, and had presumably delivered the blow to Mrs. Ashworth's head herself, or had arranged for another party to do so. The frozen grandfather clock had been Mrs. Wickham's contribution, a deliberate alteration of the timing mechanism designed to create confusion regarding the precise moment of death, thereby complicating the investigation and reducing the likelihood of anyone establishing a definitive chronology of events. Yet even this revelation had not entirely satisfied Whimsy's requirement for logical completion, for it remained unclear who had actually struck the fatal blow. Christopher possessed the motive, but appeared to lack the opportunity. Mrs. Wickham possessed the opportunity and the means, but would have required assistance in orchestrating such a carefully coordinated crime. The answer had emerged through a careful examination of the guest register maintained at the village inn, which had revealed that an individual identified as Mr. H. Carlyle had taken lodgings for 3 nights immediately preceding and following the date of Mrs. Ashworth's murder. When Whimsy had inquired regarding this mysterious guest, the innkeeper had described a man of approximately 40 years, with the bearing and appearance of someone accustomed to criminal enterprises, who had paid in cash and had maintained an extraordinarily low profile during his stay. Further investigations had revealed that Mr. H. Carlyle was actually Henry Carlyle, a professional criminal specializing in what the constabulary referred to as private enforcement, a euphemism for the commission of violent acts on behalf of paying clients. Carlyle had apparently been retained by Christopher Ashworth through intermediaries to commit the murder, an arrangement that would have provided Christopher with the appearance of plausible deniability while simultaneously ensuring the removal of his troublesome aunt through the agency of someone sufficiently detached from the household to avoid immediate suspicion. Yet Carlyle's presence at Thornfield had been facilitated entirely through Mrs. Wickham's assistance. She had arranged for his entry into the manor through a rear entrance, had provided him with knowledge of the household's layout and routines, and had ensured that he possessed sufficient opportunity to commit the crime during the carefully orchestrated window of time that Fiona's departure to summon the plumber had created. The apprehension of Henry Carlyle had proved considerably more complicated than Whimsy had initially anticipated, for the criminal had departed Thornfield immediately following the commission of his crime, and had subsequently vanished into the shadowy underworld of London's criminal enterprises with the practiced efficiency of a man accustomed to evading official scrutiny. It had required the combined efforts of Whimsy's personal contacts within Scotland Yard and several days of intensive investigation before Carlyle had finally been located in a disreputable lodging house in Whitechapel, where he had been discovered in the process of preparing his departure for the continent. His apprehension had been conducted without incident, though Carlyle had demonstrated a remarkable lack of concern regarding his situation, apparently, recognizing that Christopher Ashworth would prove an unreliable ally in his moment of need. Under interrogation, Carlyle had provided a detailed confession that confirmed the essential elements of Wimsey's deductions. He had been hired through intermediaries by Christopher Ashworth to murder Mrs. Ashworth for a sum of £500, a modest compensation for such a consequential crime, but apparently sufficient to secure Carlyle's services. He had entered the manor through the rear entrance at approximately 2:55. Had proceeded directly to Mrs. Ashworth's study under Mrs. Wickham's careful direction, and had struck his victim with the Severus paperweight at precisely 2:58, ensuring that the crime had been committed during the interval when both Fiona and cook were absent from the kitchen, and when Christopher was theoretically isolated in the library. He had then departed the manor through the same entrance by which he had arrived, had remained at the Village Inn for 2 additional nights to establish the appearance of normalcy, and had subsequently vanished into London with the practiced methodology of a professional criminal. The confession had cleared away the final obscurities regarding the mechanics of the crime. Yet it had simultaneously raised a question that had continued to trouble Wimsey throughout the investigation: the precise nature of Helena Ashworth's involvement in her husband's death 5 years prior. Dr. Marchmont's testimony had established that Sir Humphrey had been poisoned, and that Mrs. Ashworth had paid the physician to conceal evidence of this poisoning, but it remained unclear whether Helena had administered the poison herself or had merely paid for its administration by another party. This distinction, while seemingly minor, possessed considerable psychological and moral significance regarding Helena's character and the nature of her subsequent decision to reveal the historical crime. Wimsey had therefore decided to conduct a final interview with Mrs. Wickham, recognizing that the housekeeper, having already been implicated in murder through her conspiracy with Christopher and Carlyle, possessed little additional incentive to maintain her silence regarding historical events. Mrs. Wickham had proven remarkably forthcoming once she had accepted the inevitability of her own arrest and prosecution, apparently, experiencing a degree of relief at finally being able to articulate truths she had harbored for years. Mrs. Wickham had revealed that she had been present in the household at the time of Sir Humphrey's death and had possessed direct knowledge of the circumstances surrounding his demise. Sir Humphrey had been a man of considerable brutality toward his wife, Mrs. Wickham had explained with evident distaste, subjecting Helena to a pattern of psychological abuse that had manifested itself in repeated humiliation, financial control, and the systematic suppression of any intellectual ambitions she might have harbored. Helena had apparently reached a breaking point approximately 5 years prior and had decided that her husband's death was the only means by which she might obtain liberation from her oppressive circumstances. She had obtained a quantity of arsenic through intermediaries whose identities Mrs. Wickham had never fully ascertained, had administered it gradually to Sir Humphrey over a period of several weeks through the simple expedient of adding it to his evening brandy, and had then arranged for Dr. Marchmont to attribute the resulting death to cardiac failure. Mrs. Wickham had been complicit in this historical crime, not through active participation, but through her silent knowledge and her deliberate failure to raise any concerns regarding Sir Humphrey's deteriorating health. She had apparently regarded Helena's liberation from her abusive marriage with a degree of sympathetic understanding, an attitude that had predisposed her toward cooperation when Christopher and his associates had later approached her with their scheme to prevent Helena's confession. Yet this revelation had raised a troubling question in Wimsey's mind regarding the precise motivation for Helena's decision to confess after 5 years of silence. He had therefore posed this question directly to Mrs. Wickham, inquiring whether Helena had experienced any particular psychological crisis or emotional upheaval during the months preceding her death that might have precipitated her decision to reveal what she had previously concealed. Mrs. Wickham had responded with evident reluctance, explaining that Helena had apparently discovered evidence regarding Christopher's knowledge of the historical poisoning, evidence that suggested Christopher had been aware of his uncle's murder all along and had chosen to remain silent in exchange for the promise of eventual inheritance. This discovery had apparently devastated Helena, who had harbored the belief that her crime had been entirely undetected and that Christopher remained innocent of knowledge regard. His uncle's death. The revelation that her nephew had known the truth and had cynically exploited that knowledge for financial advantage had apparently triggered a profound psychological crisis in Helena, compelling her to reclaim a degree of moral agency by confessing her crime and using her estate to establish a charitable foundation that would serve purposes antithetical to Christopher's materialistic expectations. In attempting to prevent her confession through murder, Christopher had merely fulfilled the logical consequences of his own earlier moral compromises, a circularity of causation that struck whimsy as possessing a certain tragic inevitability. The confrontation with Christopher Ashworth had been conducted in the drawing room of Thornfield Manor on a grey November afternoon, with Whimsy having arranged for Craddock and 2 constables to remain discreetly positioned in the adjacent library, prepared to intervene should the accused young man prove either dangerous or inclined toward flight. Christopher had been summoned under the pretext of receiving preliminary findings regarding the investigation, an invitation he had accepted with evident relief, apparently believing that his careful construction of alibis and his exploitation of others' vulnerabilities had successfully insulated him from direct accusation. When Whimsy had calmly explained the complete chain of deduction, from the altered grandfather clock to the recruited criminal, from the blackmail payments to Mrs. Wickham's complicity, Christopher had initially attempted to maintain a facade of innocent bewilderment, insisting that the entire narrative was a tissue of speculation and conjecture unsupported by credible evidence. Yet as Whimsy had methodically presented the financial records, the testimony of Fiona and Cook, the confession of Henry Carlyle, and most damaging of all, the detailed ACC out provided by Mrs. Wickham regarding Christopher's knowledge of his uncle's poisoning and his cynical exploitation of that knowledge, the young man's defensive posture had begun to crumble with the inexorable logic of a carefully constructed mathematical proof, proving itself to be irrefutable. Christopher had then committed what Whimsy regarded as the cardinal error of the guilty. He had attempted to justify his actions through an elaborate account of his emotional suffering and his sense of betrayal at discovering his aunt's intention to substantially reduce his inheritance. He had insisted that he had not truly expected his plan to succeed, that he had merely been seeking to frighten his aunt into reconsidering her charitable impulses, that the actual commission of the murder had been an unforeseen consequence of his own reckless ambitions. These protestations of diminished responsibility had struck Whimsy as particularly contemptible, for they suggested a man attempting to distance himself from the consequences of his own deliberate choices. When Whimsy had pointed out the contradiction inherent in simultaneously denying criminal intent while acknowledging the deliberate recruitment of a professional murderer, Christopher had descended into what appeared to be a genuine psychological collapse, his careful composure disintegrating into a series of incoherent denials and emotional outbursts. He had demanded legal representation, he had threatened to invoke family connections and influence, and he had finally, in what Whimsy regarded as an almost pathetically transparent attempt at manipulation, attempted to appeal to Whimsy's alleged sympathy for the pressures that inheritance expectations had supposedly imposed upon him. Whimsy's response to these various emotional manipulations had been delivered in a tone of perfect courtesy that somehow rendered it even more cutting than any eruption of anger might have been. He had observed, with that particular quality of detached irony that characterized his most devastating remarks, that Christopher appeared to labor under the misapprehension that murder was somehow a justifiable response to disappointment regarding financial expectations, a position that Whimsy found both morally repugnant and logically indefensible. He had further noted that the young man's attempt to blame circumstances, to deny genuine culpability, and to appeal to sympathy for his alleged emotional distress constituted precisely the sort of moral cowardice that Whimsy had observed repeatedly in individuals who lacked the intellectual capacity to confront the genuine consequences of their own choices. Christopher's crime, Whimsy had explained, had not been merely the hiring of a murderer, but rather the deliberate orchestration of a conspiracy that had necessarily involved the manipulation and exploitation of vulnerable individuals, Cook, Fiona, and most damningly, Mrs. Wickham, a woman whose loyalty to the household had been repaid through inducement to participate in serious felony. At this observation, Christopher had attempted to interrupt with further protestations, but Whimsy had silenced him with a gesture of remarkable authority, proceeding to explain that the investigation had revealed not merely the mechanics of the crime, but also its psychological architecture. The way in which Christopher had deliberately constructed a criminal enterprise that would isolate and alienate him from any claim to sympathy or understanding. The arrival of the constables to place Christopher under arrest had proceeded without incident, though the young man had continued to maintain his protestations of innocence even as he was being escorted from the drawing room. Whimsy had observed his departure with an expression of mild disappointment, as though he had hoped for some final moment of genuine moral recognition or acknowledgement of culpability that had failed to materialize. Instead, Christopher had maintained his defensive posture until the very moment of his removal, suggesting a man whose capacity for psychological self-awareness had been so thoroughly corrupted by privilege and expectation that genuine confrontation with his own criminality remained perpetually beyond his comprehension. The constables had been instructed to conduct Christopher to the county lockup pending his formal charging and remand for trial, a process that would inevitably result in conviction given the overwhelming nature of the evidence arrayed against him. Craddock, emerging from the library with the satisfaction of a man whose investigative efforts had been validated through the amateur's superior deductive reasoning, had expressed his thanks in the somewhat awkward manner of a professional law enforcement officer forced to acknowledge the superiority of an outsider's methodology. Whimsy had accepted these courtesies with characteristic grace, deflecting credit toward the inspector's own solid investigative work, while privately reflecting that Craddock's principal virtue consisted of his willingness to accept assistance rather than his capacity for independent analysis. The question of Mrs. Wickham's culpability and her ultimate fate had occupied Whimsy's thoughts throughout the remainder of that November afternoon, for he recognized that the housekeeper's position in the conspiracy occupied a fundamentally different moral and legal territory than that of Christopher Ashworth or Henry Carlyle. Mrs. Wickham had not initiated the plot. She had been drawn into it through a combination of blackmail, economic desperation, and a misguided loyalty to Helena Ashworth that had apparently persisted even as she had participated in her mistress's murder. When Whimsy had subsequently interviewed Mrs. Wickham in the presence of Craddock and a solicitor whom he had thoughtfully arranged to be present, the housekeeper had demonstrated a capacity for genuine remorse and moral self-examination that had been entirely absent from Christopher's responses. She had admitted freely to her participation in the conspiracy, had provided detailed testimony regarding Christopher's recruitment of her services, and had expressed what appeared to be sincere regret regarding her complicity in Helena's death. Most significantly, Mrs. Wickham had revealed that she had harbored profound doubts regarding the wisdom of the plot, even as she had participated in its execution, and that she had been motivated by a genuine fear of what Christopher might do if she refused his demands. The nature of that fear had emerged through careful questioning, revealing a pattern of threats and psychological coercion that Christopher had apparently employed to ensure Mrs. Wickham's compliance. Christopher had threatened to expose her historical knowledge of Sir Humphrey's poisoning, had suggested that he would ensure her prosecution as an accessory to that historical crime, and had made explicit threats regarding the welfare of Mrs. Wickham's elderly mother, who resided in a modest cottage maintained through funds that Christopher had implied he could withhold at any moment. These threats had apparently been sufficient to overcome whatever moral hesitations Mrs. Wickham might have harbored, compelling her participation in a crime that she had apparently viewed with deep internal conflict. This revelation had prompted Whimsy to observe, with characteristic irony, that Christopher had demonstrated considerable creativity in his approach to criminal conspiracy, having recognized that the most effective means of ensuring others' cooperation often involved the exploitation of their existing vulnerabilities and emotional attachments, rather than the crude application of direct intimidation. Mrs. Wickham, in attempting to protect her elderly mother from threatened economic ruin, had become an unwilling participant in murder, a tragic irony that Whimsy found particularly disturbing in its demonstration of how criminal enterprises could parasitically feed upon human affection and familial obligation. The legal proceedings that had subsequently followed had proceeded with the deliberate formality characteristic of English criminal justice, with Christopher Ashworth, Henry Carlyle, and Mrs. Wickham all being remanded for trial at the county assizes. Christopher had maintained his protestations of relative innocence throughout the preliminary hearings, continuing to insist that his intentions had been merely to discourage his aunt from executing her charitable intentions rather than to facilitate her actual murder. This defense had been rendered entirely unconvincing by the accumulated evidence of his financial dealings with Carlyle, his recruitment of household staff through the exploitation of their economic vulnerabilities, and most damningly, his apparent foreknowledge of Mrs. Ashworth's intentions to alter her will in favor of scholarly pursuits. Henry Carlyle, by contrast, had adopted a posture of complete candor regarding his own culpability, apparently recognizing that any attempt at self-justification would prove futile in the face of overwhelming evidence and his own prior confession. He had accepted responsibility for the actual commission of the murder, while simultaneously maintaining that he had been merely the instrument of Christopher's criminal enterprise, a distinction that possessed considerable legal significance even if it altered the moral equation barely at all. Mrs. Wickham had occupied an intermediate position, her testimony proving invaluable to the prosecution while her own culpability remained ambiguous in a manner that had clearly troubled the legal representatives assigned to her defense. It had been this legal ambiguity regarding Mrs. Wickham's position that had prompted Whimsy to conduct a final interview with the woman in her prison cell, an encounter that had been conducted with a degree of informality that would have provoked considerable disapproval from official legal channels. Whimsy had brought with him a small package containing various documents and correspondence that had belonged to Helena Ashworth, materials that he had carefully preserved during his investigation and that he believed possessed considerable significance for the housekeeper's understanding of her own historical role within the manor's complex social dynamics. He had explained to Mrs. Wickham that these documents revealed a pattern of correspondence between Helena and Margaret Thornton, spanning more than a decade. Correspondence that demonstrated conclusively that Helena had harbored profound gratitude toward Mrs. Wickham for her silent complicity in Sir Humphrey's poisoning and for her subsequent discretion regarding the historical crime. Helena had apparently recognized that Mrs. Wickham had sacrificed her own moral purity in order to protect her mistress from the full consequences of her actions, and she had apparently intended to provide for Mrs. Wickham's comfort and security in her declining years through generous provisions in her revised will. This knowledge, which Mrs. Wickham had apparently not possessed at the time of Helena's murder, seemed to strike the housekeeper with considerable emotional force, suggesting that she had harbored unacknowledged guilt regarding her betrayal of a woman who had apparently regarded her with considerable affect, ion, and gratitude. Whimsy had observed this emotional response with characteristic detachment, recognizing in Mrs. Wickham's grief the acknowledgement of a profound moral tragedy, that in attempting to protect her elderly mother from threatened economic hardship, she had ultimately betrayed the one person in her life who had offered her genuine regard and protection. The trial of Christopher Ashworth had concluded in late January with a verdict of guilty on the charge of murder, a determination that had required the jury precisely 2 hours of deliberation to reach, suggesting a level of conviction regarding the defendant's culpability that transcended any reasonable doubt. The judge had imposed sentence with an expression of profound disapproval, observing from the bench that the case represented a particularly egregious example of how inherited privilege and material expectation could corrupt the moral sensibilities of even those who had been blessed with considerable advantages in life. Christopher had received a sentence of death by hanging, a verdict that he had received with the pale, stunned expression of a man who had apparently harbored a genuine belief that his family's social standing would somehow insulate him from the full consequences of his criminal actions. Henry Carlyle had received an identical sentence, having been convicted as the actual perpetrator of the murder, while Mrs. Wickham's trial had resulted in a conviction on the lesser charge of accessory after the fact, a determination that had reflected the jury's apparent recognition of her diminished culpability and her evidence of psychological coercion by Christopher. She had been sentenced to 7 years of penal servitude, a punishment that would see her released in her early 70s, assuming she survived the rigors of imprisonment, a circumstance that Whimsy found profoundly troubling in it. Demonstration of how the criminal justice system, for all its careful procedures and legalistic precision, often proved fundamentally incapable of addressing the genuine moral complexities underlying individual crimes. It was in the aftermath of these legal proceedings that Whimsy had decided to undertake one final task regarding the disposition of Helena Ashworth's estate, a matter that he had determined required his personal attention despite the technical conclusion of the investigation. He had traveled to London to meet with a solicitor who had been retained by Helena to execute her revised will, and he had ensured that Mrs. Wickham's elderly mother would receive the substantial provisions that Helena had apparently intended for the housekeeper herself. This act of deliberate intervention in the legal process had required considerable discretion and the careful navigation of various procedural complexities, yet Whimsy had regarded it as a fundamental obligation imposed by his understanding of how the investigation had revealed patterns of human motivation that transcended the narrow boundaries of criminal culpability. Mrs. Wickham, when subsequently informed of these arrangements, had apparently experienced a degree of emotional response that had rendered her temporarily incapable of speech, suggesting that the knowledge of Helena's continued regard, even after her death, had penetrated the walls of psychological self-protection that the housekeeper had constructed during her imprisonment. The charitable foundation that Helena had established through her revised will had been formally inaugurated in March, with substantial endowments directed toward the support of women pursuing advanced study in medieval history and manuscript preservation. Fields of intellectual endeavor that had apparently held profound significance for Helena herself. Margaret Thornton had been appointed to the Board of Trustees, a position that had allowed her to honor her long-standing friendship with Helena through the perpetuation of causes that her deceased friend had regarded as infinitely more valuable than the perpetuation of her nephew's indolent and morally compromised existence. Whimsy had attended the dedication ceremony in a purely unofficial capacity, observing from the periphery as Margaret and various academic figures had praised Helena's vision and her commitment to the advancement of women's intellectual pursuits. The irony that Helena's greatest legacy had emerged not from her years of conformity to conventional expectations, but rather from her final, desperate decision to confront the moral consequences of her own historical crimes, had struck Whimsy as possessing a certain tragic grandeur, a demonstration of how the human capacity for redemption sometimes manifested itself only in the moment of approaching death. Whimsy's return to London and to his customary existence had been marked by a period of uncharacteristic quietude during which he had occupied himself with the cataloguing of an extensive collection of first editions and the consumption of considerable quantities of excellent Burgundy. When Bunter, his devoted valet, had inquired with characteristic tactfulness whether his employer had found the Thornfield investigation particularly taxing, Whimsy had responded with a remark that suggested the case had left him contemplating the fundamental inadequacy of criminal justice systems that often seem to punish the desperate and coerced while simultaneously failing to adequately address the systemic moral failures that bred such desperation. The grandfather clock at Thornfield, he had noted, had eventually been repaired by a competent horologist and had resumed its regular chiming, though the mechanism that Christopher had deliberately altered would always remain, in Whimsy's mind, a symbol of how criminal enterprises frequently depended upon the deliberate distortion of temporal reality, the creation of confusion regarding timing and sequence that allowed murderers to obscure the precise moment of their crimes. Yet time, Whimsy had reflected with characteristic philosophical disposition, ultimately revealed all secrets, however carefully concealed, for the simple reason that human beings possessed an insurmountable need to articulate their own histories and to seek some form of meaning from the chaotic events that constituted their lives. As November had given way to December, and the Christmas season had approached with its customary insistence upon festive sentiment and manufactured goodwill, Whimsy had occasionally found his thoughts returning to Thornfield Manor and to the various individuals whose lives had been irreversibly altered by the investigation's revelations. He had wondered whether Christopher, awaiting execution in his prison cell, had finally experienced some genuine moment of moral self-recognition, or whether he had continued to the very end to regard himself as essentially a victim of circumstance rather than the architect of his own catastrophic choices. He had considered whether Mrs. Wickham, in her prison cell, had found some degree of peace in the knowledge that Helena's regard for her had persisted even unto death, or whether the housekeeper had been consumed by remorse regarding her betrayal of the woman who had apparently constituted the nearest approximation to human affection in her otherwise austere existence. Yet these speculations, Whimsy had recognized, represented merely the idle musings of a detective whose work had concluded, but whose mind continued to circle around the profound questions of human motivation and moral responsibility that crime investigation inevitably raised. He had therefore resolved to set the matter aside and to await with philosophical equanimity whatever new crimes and mysteries the future might present, secure in the knowledge that the careful application of logic and observation would invariably reveal the truth that lay beneath even the most elaborate criminal deceptions.